that means. End quote. Theory anew, in this sense, is not to be found within the boundaries of academic discourse or arts experiments, but in a way at the crossroads of intellectual labor and creative activism, in specific yet radical, pragmatic yet critical forms of political activism. Against theory, but also history, working as a totalizing discourse and silencing those who are subjected, genealogy, in the sense Foucault gives to that word, is the only way, in his view, to let such struggling types of knowledge rise again, remonter. The third example, which I'll make shorter, is actually closer to the discursive nature of theory discussed above. It comes from a surprising interview with Roland Barthes in 1970 by the French literary journal TXT. Interviewed on literature, for some reason, Roland Barthes replies on theory, but not theory of literature, theory in general, connecting theory in general to a post-disciplinary, fragmented, subjectively performative form of enunciation. Far from older theories, plural, of science and abstraction. I quote Barthes. A certain discontinuous, fragmented nature of examination, almost comparable to aphoristic or poetic types of enunciation, set against theory as the rule of the signifier, which never stops to dissolve the multiplicity of the signifier, and favors monology, origin, determination, everything that does not account for multiplicity, end quote. So, theory in this interview, he understands as the only thing that can be a struggle to crack Western symbolics, fissurer la symbolique occidentale. Not so far, in fact, for literary theorists, from the ethical and political impulse of intensive philosophers at the same time, to fight on the other side of emancipated forms of knowledge and the positivity of desire. Theory, maybe, in those very elusive words by Barthes, might be the very liberation of enunciation. I would suggest one final connection, way more arguable, but at the same time, the only echo I could find was the great presentation by Alain that just took place. A connection with a non-intensive and non-French thinker, connection with Martin Heidegger, and his take on the word theory in a 1954 short text inserted in the volume The Question Concerning Technology. The text is called Science and Reflection. The verb, because he reminds us that theory in Greek is a verb, doesn't exist under another form than verbal. The verb comes from two Greek root words, thea and rao, and accounts for the further degrading of theory into science in a typically Heideggerian genealogy. Thea rao could be translated, Heidegger suggests, I quote his text, as to look attentively on the outward appearance wherein what presents becomes visible, and through such sight to linger with it, end quote. A meaning which is precisely degraded according to Heidegger, with the Latin translation of the verb theorein, the degrading of Latin translation of Greek words was exactly your point. The translation in Latin being contemplatio, with its root word templum, templum meaning to cut, to part, to seize also. Heidegger adds, there comes to the fore the impulse already prepared in Greek thinking of a looking at that sunders and compartmentalizes, end quote. Before, of course, in his account, modern rationality and science, in typical Heideggerian fashion, started entrapping and securing the real. I quote him again, science challenges forth the real, specifically through aiming its objectness. Science sets upon the real. And he quotes at the end of this paragraph the famous word by Max Planck, which is probably the sort of scapegoat, of repulsive formula in Heidegger's fashion, that is real, which can be measured. Of course, we're very far from French theory here. But in a way, we're thickly connected to its struggle against the aggressive totalizing gesture of classical theory. And not so far, again, taking into account the difference in context, not so far from its inner splitting of theory, the split destiny of theory, which is at the same time available to let the silented speak and doomed to encapsulate the multiplicity of the real. That sort of schizophrenia, clivage of the word, is present in this text by Heidegger as much as it is in those three French examples. One last word of conclusion. The loose historical frame in which I implicitly located this crisis of theory and reinvention of theory, this madness of theory and parting of theory from itself, could very well resemble less an actual kehre, a radical change in orientation and episteme, than just a bracketed episode, a short-lived enclave in time and space, an enclave in which theory and desire, politics and radical critique, have been allowed to try and work side by side, before a global counter-revolution swept away such topics, a global backlash, despite the maintained critical audacity of English-speaking academia and of activism in other parts of the world, a backlash which has taken peculiar forms in France, especially in the French intellectual field. Moral blackmail, civilizational conservatism, the reinforcement of age-old abstract universalism and republicanism, a series of returns to, and a student in a class of History 101 would know that there is never return to. Returns to democracy, returns to Kant, to reason, or to social peace, with so many quote marks on each of these words. An overall atmosphere in which, despite a new generation of intellectuals, despite new political and artistic uses of theory, and new connection between those uses, the feverish atmosphere of that mad theory era remains unimaginable today. But enough with nostalgia, the sort of fictional nostalgia of a time I didn't get to know, and rather, let's have theory's politics open onto new becomings. Thank you very much.